Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm your host for this episode of Cut the Crop. And today we've got two researchers from Scotland's Rural College, based just outside of Aberdeen. So welcome to Henry Creissen and Fiona Burnett. So we're going to have a little bit of a chat about the work that they've been doing in Scotland on IPM, on integrated pest management. This is an area that FAR has been working on for the last 5 years, and we're really interested to see what our colleagues in Scotland have been doing in this area as well. So maybe I'll start off with you, Henry, and just ask, what's the programme of work that you've been doing in Scotland on IPM?
Thanks, Alison. So I guess we've been working on IPM since before we were calling it IPM, in terms of we've been constantly developing sustainable crop protection practices and trying to work out the best ways to implement them. Most of my work as an applied plant pathologist concerns developing sustainable disease management programs for arable crops. So particularly in Scotland, focusing on wheat and barley, also potatoes and things like that as well. More recently, even though we started doing some more of the sort of fundamental work on working out the value of varieties and the effectiveness on fungicide, which is a constantly reoccurring theme throughout our research, because there's always changes in efficacy and new products coming to market. More of my work now is looking at the integration of different IPM components. So as an example, I was out at field trials yesterday at various different research institutes and also on farm, where we're looking at the combination of tillage regimes, so looking at direct drill versus ploughing, how that interacts with different varieties and how that affects disease and the fungicide requirement. And these are sort of things that haven't really been done before, largely because there's been a lot of investment in varieties and fungicides, and because that's where a lot of the money has been made by industry. So trying to push out of that, just focusing on those two sort of IPM components and thinking about how that works in these systems that we're finding ourselves more and more working with, particularly with this sort of revival of the regenerative agriculture, conservation, tillage sort of movement.
Yeah. So maybe Fiona, at a higher level, what's the driver for IPM in the UK at the moment? Is it coming from the consumer, that they want to see a lighter touch, with the way in which people are managing their crops? Or is it because of efficacy that that the existing management practices aren't working, or a combination of both?
Right, Alison, a combination of both. So it would be a certain amount of market pressure. There's a lot of interest in regenerative practices and reduced, use of pesticides, but absolutely it's coming from the coalface realization as well that, we're losing pesticides. We've lost a lot recently through, them coming off regulatory lists, and with resistance nibbling away at other actives as well. So that kind of genuine move to more resilient systems where growers are using more resistant varieties is one of the more popular options. And coming to the idea that there's a drive from consumers, that's great. And what we really want is that there would be premiums for growers based on more resilient practices. But from my point of view, there are plenty of win-wins where we can do the more sustainable practices, but still get better margins and, better responses in field trials and commercially into the bargain.
Yeah, that's interesting, the whole issue of would you get a premium for it. It's a really difficult thing, because I think consumer expectations now are that, production practices should be more sustainable, and that's almost a requirement. So it would be great if growers could see a premium. I'm not sure in New Zealand that, it will actually deliver a premium, because we tend to have a domestic market rather than an export market. It's very difficult to sort of look for premiums. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see, if you could drive a premium for that. Would be great.
It would be the aspiration.
Yes, exactly. But the reality is, and it's really important for New Zealand, because we often look to the UK, to see what is likely to happen with crop protection practices in New Zealand, because often when you start losing efficacy with fungicides or having resistance problems, it will tend to come 2-3 years later. We'll start noticing the same thing. So you're a bit like our canary down the mine, that when we see things happening in the UK, we can predict that we better get onto that, because that's a problem that we're likely to have as well. But coming back to you, Henry, let's just talk about some of the specific programs that you're involved in. And I'm really interested in how you're actually researching and testing IPM programs and determining actually whether they work or not. And are you looking at the economics as well as the performance? And is this just looking at it by a crop by crop basis, or are you looking at it like at a whole farm systems basis?
Yeah, so you touched on one of the main sort of ways we can encourage IPM practices. We can either do it through sort of premiums or subsidies for IPM, or we can do it by proving that there's an economic advantage of adopting these practices. So if you're growing more resistant varieties, perhaps it allows you to pull back on your fungicide spend, and as a result, you're going to have a more profitable crop. But there are lots of ways in which we can talk about IPM. At the very high level, it's really a sustainable approach to pest management that's very holistic and tries to maximize productivity and profitability whilst minimizing any negative impacts on the environment. And the tricky thing with IPM is it can mean different things to different people, and it works across various scales, so from the landscape scale right down to the specific pest crop combination. And many people have different ideas as to what IPM should be delivering, whether that be a reduction in pesticide use or reduction in harmful pesticides, or maybe some environmental measures that they're looking at, water quality. There's lots of different ways of assessing IPM, but they often hinge on a specific sort of proxy related to the specific goal. So what we've done over the last few years, this is work I started when I was working in Ireland, and you talked about us being the canary, sort of Ireland is the sort of canary for us. And so I was working over there, and we developed a universal metric for assessing IPM adoption, because there's so many different tools and techniques that can constitute IPM practice, and those set of techniques and the combinations of them will vary from farm to farm, from situation to situation. So we designed a short questionnaire assessing all of the 8 IPM principles, and involved about 50 stakeholders, typically those directly involved in the IPM decision making, so farmers, agronomists, with a few researchers and that as well, to sort of co-design this metric, which involves them weighting the individual questions and the options according to how important they are for IPM. And overall, we get a score from 0 to 100 for how much IPM is being practiced according to the expert opinion. And this has been really useful in that we have this now sort of composite universal metric, which we can baseline adoption of IPM. And this can be done at a national level, regional level, and a farm by farm level. So at the moment, we've launched these IPM plans based on that work. We launched them last year, and there's been about 8,000 completed to date. And they're used by the farmer to sort of look at what's being done now, have a decision with the agronomist, and hopefully take steps to improve IPM adoption and improve that IPM score. Because a lot of it is about awareness, and we found through our work that if you can increase familiarity with IPM, you can increase adoption. And there's obviously some constraints to that depending on the systems, markets, and things like that. But broadly speaking, knowledge results in IPM actions.
So you talk about a score. So do you find that that does it become competitive? Do growers talk to each other about the kind of score that they get? I mean, do you find that providing that kind of quantitative metric drives behaviour change?
Certainly like to hope to think so. We recognise that through various other sort of projects and schemes that farmers can be very competitive. So rather than bragging about their barn filling high yields, we'd hope that they're sort of bragging more about the IPM practices they've adopted to make their system more resilient and more sustainable and also profitable as well. Farming is a business, so by making your system more robust, and then hopefully you can sustain that profitability over time.
I'm interested, I mean, are you looking at, a lot of new biological products, to replace some of the synthetic products? We've been sort of tasting a lot of biopesticides in New Zealand. Just interested to know whether you've got a cohort of new biological products coming through that might be, good alternatives to some of the synthetics as part of your integrated pest management program.
Yes, we've been doing a lot of research over the last few years on various different sort of biopesticides, but in particular elicitors of plant defense responses. So we found that if we can use these products, and they may be based on fungi, bacteria, seaweeds, there's various different extracts that can be used to pull out these elicitors, and we can apply them to the crop early on in the growing season to prime plant defense responses, so that when there is a real pathogen challenge later in the season, that the plant does a lot better at resisting that challenge. So we're looking now, we've done a lot of work on individual products, and now we're looking at how they perform in IPM programs where you've got a reduced use of synthetic fungicides plus this elicitor. And there are a few on the market now, and we project there'll be a lot more available as for the reasons that Fiona said earlier. It's harder to get new active ingredients through the regulatory process, so companies are more likely to start investing heavily in biopesticides and elicitors within that sort of group.
So, Fiona, one of the challenges that, we can see in New Zealand around, sort of, I guess, a more holistic way of managing pests and diseases is the fact that, growers have been used to being able to go into their shed and pick up a chemical and spray it on. And IPM obviously requires a lot more detailed understanding of the biology of the pests and the biology of the plants, and it's a more whole system approach. How are you finding the adoption and uptake by the growers? Are they receptive to, I guess, putting more time and effort into understanding what's happening with pests and diseases in their crops?
I think they are, Alison, and they see the benefits from reduced reliance on pesticides. But I think both Henry and I are quite keen to kind of get over the idea that IPM is something complex and other. Actually, a lot of what growers are already doing, as Henry has said, they're not labelling it as IPM, but the kind of, the practices around sensible rotations, varieties, monitoring what you're doing, checking on the efficacy of previous applications, that's all stuff that really is at the core of most good farming practice. So I think that's a kind of key thing to promote, that IPM's perhaps not as complex and confusing as it's made out. And again, going back to the scoring system that Henry was describing, actually that's been great in that it shows that everybody's doing something. Many of the scores, I mean, they average well over 50%, don't they, Henry? There's a range there. But I think that's a kind of very key message for our industry, that we're already doing a lot of this and every farm can improve a bit. But yeah, we see great enthusiasm from growers to do a little bit more. They are competitive, as you've hinted, but we're kind of keen that people see that they're competing against themselves, that they're improving their own score rather than kind of artificially inflating or looking at what the neighbours are doing. So yeah, I think the direction of travel is very positive.
So what about, knowledge exchange between growers? Are you finding that you're getting groups of growers within, regions sharing their expertise and helping each other achieve, IPM goals?
Well, we do find that those higher scorers in terms of IPM adoption are typically part of a discussion group, so sharing information amongst their peers, and particularly engaging with us as researchers directly. So they'll come up to open days and things like that. They're actively seeking that knowledge, and those are the ones that are typically the higher adopters. There are other constraints and you've first got to have the capacity to implement those practices. You've got to have machinery, labour, fields, and access to markets and things like that. But those are sort of things that are very hard for us to change. What we can do is better direct our research and development and our KTE practices, knowledge exchange practices, to meet their needs and encourage them to, as Fiona said, constantly be moving up that continuum towards the maximum score, but also, as well as the score, they'll get the other benefits that Fiona's talked about along the way as well, improvements in efficiency and profitability, and they'll see the other benefits on farm in terms of environmental indicators as well.
So you talked about profitability there. So has your research been able to show that either that there's no loss in productivity or more importantly, profitability if you transition to an IPM system?
I don't think there's really sort of an IPM system, as it were, as there is, as Fiona said, there's like a continuum. So with our score, the lower scores would be around the sort of 20% and the higher scores up around the 90%. So we'd be taking steps to try and encourage people to make incremental improvements. And as you do that, you're layering more and more different IPM measures. You get certain synergies that can really sort of push forward your profitability is going to be one of the main ones, and people wouldn't do IPM if it wasn't profitable to do so. It's very hard to link a score for IPM to as a SPAR metric to economics, but we can look at individual examples when you're, again, going back to the using resistant varieties, putting back on fungicides in a sort of simple sense. But there are many other sort of examples when we're talking about IPM that can yield those benefits. But it's important to talk about profitability in space and time as well, because poor crop husbandry practices, crop protection practices could lead to issues way down the line in terms of diseases, soil-borne diseases persisting for decades, and burying weed seeds that are going to be in the seed bank and rear their ugly head in 50 years' time, for example. So it's about thinking about the longevity of it. And I like one of the farmers that I speak to regards himself as a custodian of the land. He's looking after the land for the next generation. He's not trying to milk it for everything it's worth right now, because that's going to leave someone else to deal with all the problems. And I like that sort of self-imposed responsibility that these more proactive or innovative farmers have adopted.
Yeah. So maybe just to finish off, I'll just ask both of you the question around, lessons learned, and maybe, some suggestions for things that worked really well that New Zealand could start looking at. So maybe just talk to Fiona first. What would be some of the key lessons that have been learned from the programme of work that you've been doing recently?
Well, we did some quite interesting work around kind of people's perceptions and attitudes, where in general growers know what the right answers are, so they'll say absolutely resistant varieties, but then when you look at what's actually done in practice, it's very different to what they perhaps think they're doing. So there were some very useful lessons there. And I think maybe just going back to your point about, costs and profitability, I think there are huge benefits where you bring in something profitable, like we're trying to work more with legumes and rotations. So that can massively improve farm margins. But it would be, we recognise that there are real costs as well in terms of more time maybe spent going to open days, picking up first-hand knowledge. And, some of the, you referenced biologicals and things, some of those will be an extra cost in the programme, but we see at least they're maintaining the yield. So pluses and minuses, Alison.
And so, Henry, what about you? Any sort of key insights that you can give us about the work that you've been doing and what worked well and what didn't?
Sure. So we've recently completed a project with colleagues in England developing crop-specific IPM tools where growers are directed towards effective control measures for specific pests and then encouraged to indicate whether that's in practice now, will not be in practice, or plans to be introduced in the short and the long term, because there can be sort of quite low-hanging fruit in IPM. It can be sort of quite simple measures that can achieve quite significant returns. But thinking about the longer term in terms of the benefits of, say, rotation, you might not realise for 5-10 years, whereas the benefits of choosing a more effective fungicide, you might realise within a season. So it's trying to capture that full range of responses and not make it too much of a unachievable, sort of scary goal for farmers, because they're already doing IPM practices. We just need to better support them and with regards to knowledge exchange, we can do a lot when thinking about webinars and open days and things like that. But the main sort of decision makers on farm are the farmer and, crucially, their agronomist. So including the agronomists in this discussion, making sure that they're invested, because ultimately we're not going to have the direct impact on farm. But if we can convince the agronomists that what we're doing is good practice, they've got that trusted relationship with the farmer to create farm-specific IPM plans, and through that we'll see greater adoption. And that's what we have seen in the last few projects we've been working on as well.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you. Lots of nice, interesting insights on what's happening with IPM in bonnie Scotland. So thank you very much, both Henry and Fiona. And thank you, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.